Hello, everyone. Welcome to your very first ever inaugural episode of Box Talks, where we talk about film history and hope everything goes fine. I'm working on this intro, don't worry. So, welcome to the first session where we will be talking about German Expressionism, specifically its origins and its relation to horror, and of course, its legacy. So, I figured that it would be a great time to talk about this because, as of recording this, it is 2 days away from good old Halloween. So it's only fair that we talk about something relatively spooky, right? Yeah? Okay. Alright, so, big old fat forward. There is a lot to cover and talk about in relation to German Expressionism. It's a film movement. This is not a film genre. We are talking about a whole artistic movement. German Expressionism goes beyond just the films, which, are related to German Expressionism, but there's also like actual Expressionism, which is, the arts, the architecture, things like that. We will be covering those, some bits and pieces, but we are focusing primarily on German Expressionism, the film movement. And even then, within the film movement, there is a lot to cover. So, in that regard, directors, movies, socioeconomic factors, local and international factors, so on and so forth. The list continues. And for everyone's sake, I'm not going to go into extreme detail. I am not here to overwhelm anyone, overwhelm any viewers or the like. In regards to this, this is a focused experience, but not extremely focused. Again, I am not covering every aspect of this entire movement. I am covering certain aspects that I think are important to the topic, so you will see me talk about specific films that are related to like the formation of the horror genre that we know today, and other things like that. We'll cover that in the next slide in more specificity. At the end of the day, I hope all of this will just get you interested in doing your own research as well. I've done my fair share, but as I said, I'm not going to cover everything. If there's something that you find, like if there's a question you find interesting, or there's a thread that I don't cover fully and you want to dig into it, please do. Please do. Because if you chase something that you find interesting or follow your curiosity, it will make the process of digging and researching that much more enjoyable. At least that's what, in my opinion, that's what I like. That's what I find fun about this, even if there are some speed bumps in the way, but that's for another discussion. So, what are we covering specifically? Well, origins of the movement. Specifically, we're talking through non-artistic factors, so like the world stage at the time, state of the world, any government shenanigans, any economic states issues, so on and so forth, and also the defining characteristics of Expressionism as a whole. There is a difference between Expressionism and German Expressionism, but German Expressionism takes characteristics from Expressionism, so do not worry, we will get to that shortly. Once we've covered the origins, we will go on a slight tangent. We will be talking about what exactly was, air quotes, horror, pre-1931 Dracula. So things like defining horror, like the actual term horror and its relation to German Expressionism, and the history of the term horror film, because that is what I consider something very important to understand before we go into actually talking about Dracula. Again, this is another slight tangent, but I think Dracula is very, very important to cover, because not only from like this movie was the movie that placed horror onto like the public space and like marketing and all that, but also like how Dracula breathed life into the term horror film. And we will be covering not the actual film Dracula. We won't be talking about any aspect of the film, but rather we're going to be talking about the marketing. The marketing of Dracula is what is perhaps the most interesting part of the actual production, in my opinion, since it leads to basically what we define as horror, and then from there we can go into Caligari and post-German Expressionism. Obviously, we will be talking about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of the defining films of the German Expressionism movement, and also just, in my opinion, a really, really good film. So, that said, oh yes, and of course, Caligari and German Expression's legacy and influence after the film movement, because again, it goes past this entire time frame. It seeps its way into Hollywood and other forms of media in ways that you don't expect if you don't know where to look. So hopefully you'll see those influences after everything is said and done, and everything that we covered in this good old first session of Vox Talks. So, what exactly is Expressionism? Well, this is going to be a very brief overview, but this is extremely important to cover. Expressionism originated in Northern Europe, primarily focused within Germany. This was formed around the years predating World War I, as it was a movement that was encompassed by many aspects of personal expression, so arts, literature, architecture, the list continues. It is primarily characterized by emotion and ideas being valued over what's real. So in the realm of Expressionism, emotion and ideas are highlighted. So what that means is basically any form of artistic realism is more or less thrown out the window in favor of other aspects. Think of it as more personal expression. It manifests in extreme distortion. If you look to the good old Scream on the right, you may notice that everything is distorted in some way, shape, or another. And as you may notice, elongated bodies, exaggerated expressions, things like that are part of the movement. Also, angular or drooping buildings. You do not see this here, but keep this in mind because architecture will play a very, very important role in German Expressionism films, and especially Caligari. And with the Scream here, I think the Scream actually exhibits this perfectly. Bright and natural colors that are contrasted by dark and cartoony outlines. I'm sure I don't need to state this, but there is a lot of... Sorry, I'm spaced out. Doing fine, I promise. As you can see here, there's a lot of high contrast, especially with regards to the skyline primarily, but also not only that, but also the wood on the bridge. I'm assuming that is wood, and also the skin tone of the figure in the front doing the scream, and it's contrasted by the shadows and outlines that you see on the bridge, the shadows on the river, so on and so forth. So now that I've more or less given you a brief overview of Expressionism as a whole, we can move on over to the factors leading to German Expressionism, because this did not pop up simply out of the blue. There were real world reasons for this movement coming up. Not only did Expressionism itself, the movement itself, play a major part in forming German Expressionism as a film movement, but there was actual issues plaguing Germany at the time. Notably, Germany was incredibly isolated during World War I, and this was furthered by both international and local factors. There was a large anti-German sentiment. Internationally, there was a ban on German-made films, and furthermore, audiences simply avoided anything German. Locally, there was a ban by the German government of importing foreign films in 1916. This may sound bad, but in relation to Germany, this led to a massive increase of local film productions. For reference, there was only 24 domestic films in 1914. 4 years later, they made 130 domestic films. That is a considerable increase in film production. Another thing to note is this import ban ended in December 31st, 1920. This is a 5-year period of no domestic competition within the German film market. Looking at this from a simple marketing standpoint, because at the end of the day, film is a business, it is a way to make money, in spite of the fact that, in spite of us seeing it as an art form, it is still a business. There's money to be made. It is a product. Putting this into perspective, 5 years of no domestic competition is really, really good. That is essentially a monopoly of their own cinema market. Keep that in mind, because we will talk about this further onwards, which is technically right now. Needless to say, post-World War I Germany and their economy was in shambles. Germany was already taxed by its losses during the war. Now it was furthered by reparations towards the Allied powers. This not only came in the form of money, but also various goods as well: clothes, metal, food, so on and so forth. This in turn led to shortages. As basic supply and demand dictates basic market laws, the less of something there is, the more expensive it becomes. This in turn led to the extreme inflation of the German paper mark. In late 1923, $1 equated to, let me read this right, 4,210,500,000,000 marks. During this time, Germans would find more practical uses for their money. For example, using it as fuel for their furnaces, since buying wood or coal was far too expensive. Ooh, excuse me. Also, at the time, you would see the average German carrying around baskets of money, baskets of their German paper mark. That's how little value their money had back in the day. Now, excuse me. How does this relate to the film market? Well, we're gonna cover that right now, because paradoxically, the paper mark losing value was good, primarily for film. The ever-decreasing value encouraged immediate spending, and in a kind of morbid way, movies were more available over clothing and food. So the average German would spend most of their currency at cinemas and watching film, which in turn led to more theaters being built to match this increase in demand. But not only that, inflation also benefited exporting over importing. Given the widely disproportionate values of their own currency, it was easier to sell local goods and significantly harder to buy foreign goods. In relation to film, this meant that it was very easy to export German films, but very hard to import foreign films. If, say, you were a foreign country looking to import films internationally, it might be cheaper to buy German films over Hollywood in some cases. This, in turn, meant that German cinema flourished both locally and internationally. Does that make all sense? I hope that gives a good enough understanding of how German cinema and German Expressionism came to the forefront of Germany and also cinema at the time. So keep this in mind as we go into the characteristics of German Expressionism. As discussed with Expressionism at the very beginning, German Expressionism is a rejection of cinematic realism. What is cinematic realism? It is the approach to making, essentially, emulating reality within a film. Stylization is usually avoided. That is not to say you cannot make a stylized movie. It is simply just saying, we do not want to make this, I, as a director, do not want to make this movie too stylized. I do not want to break reality within my film, per se. Knowing this, German Expressionism is obviously the opposite of cinematic realism. They use cinema as a vehicle to express emotions and ideas through exaggeration and stylization. This primarily manifests through its distorted and exaggerated mise en scène. Pardon my French, if I mispronounce that, I am sorry, I'm doing my best. Mise en scène refers to anything and everything in front of the camera. It is the staging the shot, actors included. In relation to the movement, this means that actors deliberately exaggerate and repeat their movements. Set designs are abstract, much like its counterparts in art and architecture, and there is a heavy emphasis on, pardon my Italian, chiaroscuro lighting. While everything in front of the camera was deliberately complex and, for lack of a better term, wild, editing was relatively simple. It kept the focus on what the director wanted to capture. Now, I mentioned chiaroscuro lighting. What exactly is it? It's the use of high contrast lighting to emphasize light and shadow. It is commonly used to enhance the drama and emotions conveyed, and also to emphasize any thematic ideas that the director wants to show the audience. Many films use this technique. Simply, here are some examples from specific films from varying years. Basically, starting from the left, we have Nosferatu 1922. That is also from the German Expressionist movement, but we are not covering that in proper detail. I will mention it later, briefly. And then we have Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles, one of Welles' most popular films, and also a really good film. And of course, even when we go into color cinema, we have good old Godfather, 1972, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. These, again, are just specific examples from specific films to show that, and from specific years to show that this is just not a one-off trick. This is a technique that directors deliberately use to enhance their film in some way, shape, or form. So keep an eye out for that if you do watch a film and notice that, oh, this lighting is pretty high contrast. Is this chiaroscuro? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is this chiaroscuro? Now that we've covered the characteristics, what about the stories of German Expressionism? Primarily, they are tales surrounding the fantastical and uncanny, often told in subjectivity. They're often dark and moody, and often set in strange and or exotic locales, though that doesn't have to be the case every single time. With this in mind, aspects from fantasy and or horror do show up, and sometimes show pretty often as well. Films such as Nosferatu, as I mentioned, Metropolis, and Caligari, the Lanimos will cover later, are examples of this. And another thing to note is that characters often blend and merge with the settings. Actors and sets coexist and complement each other alongside their lighting. Let's talk about set design. Oh boy. Oh, I could go so much into set design, but we'll just have to keep it to one slide because I do not want to overwhelm you. I'd be remiss not to talk about set designs, so let's talk about it. Once again, the designers have thrown out any concept of normal artistic perspectives and proportions. It draws primarily from monumentalism and modernism in architecture. In short, it translates to big, grand architecture and the rejection of the old / experimentation with the new. You will see very strange shapes within their architecture or unusual aspects, as you see with the top left, top right. The doorway, I assume it's a doorway. The doorway isn't really uniform per se. And then monumentalism is the bottom picture. The scale within that shot is very, very large. The buildings essentially dwarf the workers there. That is a shot from Fritz Metropolis, by the way. Those little lines are actually people. These little lines over here are actually people in relation to the buildings and other megastructures at the time. Also, productions often worked with expressionist artists and designers to form their sets, which overall led to its iconic aesthetic coupled with the actors and lighting. So, now that we've covered that, I have a question to pose you all. What do we define as horror? What do we define as a horror film, rather? But also, what do we define as horror? These are all various horror films from various times. Some of them I've watched, some of them I know of. Aside from that, what do we think, chat? What do we think? What do we define as horror? It can be as long and or short as you want it to be. Maybe it's monsters, maybe it's creatures of the night, or maybe it's just your neighbor who you think is a bit off but can't really place it, you know? What do we have in mind for horror? Any other examples in chat, perhaps? Any other examples? No? No other examples? Alright. Let's get it. Alright. In that case, I'm going to scooty booty on over to the next slide. At the end of the day, horror is subjective, right? What we find scary might not be scary in the future. It changes with time. For example, might be at one point, unknown creatures or other humans, or perhaps it's the supernatural, or even the simple thought of this could happen to you. It's loose enough to be its own word, rather. It's a nebulous word. Pardon me, it's a nebulous word, both in definition and use when it comes to describing things. I'm gonna pull from an example here real quick. Reefer Madness is an exploitation film. This is not a horror film by any means of horror. This is not horror. This is not a horror film. This is an exploitation film about drug use. But at the time, you could argue that it is horror. It'd be a stretch, but you could, because at the time, people are scared of drugs. And this was targeted towards that fear. It's also a quick aside, it's also it's a great movie. It's not actually a great movie, but it is a movie worth watching, in my opinion. But it's not a scary film. But because it was portrayed as something that could happen to you, combined with the already negative perception of marijuana at the time, this was scary. Reefer Madness would later be rediscovered in a later time and made fun of. So that it is a prime example of what we find scary changes with time. Which now brings us to the term horror in early cinema. So where does the term horror fall within this time period? There was no standardized terminology for describing films. It depended on who was exhibiting the film at the time. For example, trick pictures often referred to special effects, but other terms like magical, fantastical, mythical, and mysterious could also be used to describe it. These terms could also be used to describe horror films. That wasn't to say horror wasn't used, it was used. It saw use, but it was rare, a loose descriptor like everything else that I mentioned above. When it was used to describe battle scenes or the supernatural. Occasionally, it was attached to films or movies, but that rarely occurred before Dracula. Yes, we are on a slight tangent now about Dracula. Released in 1931, directed by Todd Browning and distributed by Universal Pictures. This film, while not being related to German Expressionism, has to be talked about. This is largely considered to be the film that brought the term horror film to the mainstream. However, we need to talk about its marketing. Again, we are not here to talk about any filmic aspect of Dracula. We are here to talk about its marketing. Because this is where we see the term horror film or horror cinema come to life. And it's simply because of this film's marketing. There was a lot of hesitance towards the term horror at the time, so much so that Universal Pictures avoided marketing it as such. They even avoided terms like terror or blood. Now, why did they do this? It's likely for a single reason, but an understandable reason. To avoid censorship. Now, censorship, back in the day especially, was not the best thing to happen to your film, because it often made or broke the film's premiere. If a film got censored, that meant the local board or the overseeing party, depending on the time period, didn't like what the film was showing and politely asked, air quotes, politely asked the producers of the film to remove certain aspects of the film. And if it did get censored, it was possible that audiences would simply avoid it because the film was, for lack of a better term, too spicy for the time being. In conjunction with Universal's avoidance of certain words, exhibitors were told to avoid marketing Dracula as a mystery, since mystery at the time was used to describe other horror-coded films. If it was a horror movie in any way, shape, or form, or if it had horrific aspects, you would see mystery attached to it, or mysterious. In some cases. It depends. Again, mystery, like every other word in this time period, was very loose and was thrown around a lot. Unfortunately, in spite of that, it did not stop advertisers from and exhibitors from labeling the film as a mystery. You can see it on these advertisements for Dracula. Now playing this year's greatest mystery thriller, amongst other things. It was a common sight to see in newspapers where not only mystery was used, but also weird and other descriptors that insinuated that this film was indeed a horror movie. Crowds held breathless, weird, he walks at night, haunting, fascinating, speckles, books, mystery talkie. RKO Keats, weird, chills, thrills, Bela Lugosi of the stage play Dracula. All these perpetuated the idea that Dracula was indeed a horror movie. And it was. And it was actually thanks to this blatant ignorance to Universal's "please don't do this" is what led to the introduction of the term horror film or horror cinema, coupled with Dracula's box office success and the fact that basically everybody that wasn't Universal Pictures, that being the critics, audiences, and newspapers, spread that word around. All of these factors helped shape the term horror film that we use today. Now that we've covered horror film, let's talk about one of the first horror films, and the good old star of the show, in my opinion, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Released in 1920 and directed by Robert Wien. I'm pronouncing it right. I'm sorry, Germans. This is a tale about the titular Dr. Caligari, a hypnotist that commands a somnambulist Cesar to commit countless murders. Now, let's talk about the story. I apologize in advance, there will be some minor spoilers if you haven't seen this, but I have to cover it because it's very important. A major theme found within Caligari's story is the human psyche or subjectivity. The story is primarily told through the perspective of Francis, the person on the left. They are the protagonist, is essentially a flashback with a unreliable narrator. What is true? What is not true? How much is embellished by Francis' storytelling? How much isn't? And other aspects like that. Another centralizing theme is the warping and the manipulation of the mind. Not by Francis per se, but rather through Caligari. Not only is he a hypnotist, but also revealed to be insane. Or so the audience believes. Because Caligari has a twist ending. This is not emblematic of the German Expressionism movement. This is specifically relating to Caligari itself. But this is a twist ending where it is revealed that Francis is a patient of a mental institution, that all individuals within his recollections are patients as well. The titular Dr. Caligari is actually the head of the asylum. This was the first film to ever use this plot device, which is extremely interesting and helps not only in terms of dealing with the themes of human psyche and subjectivity, but also, in a sense, it manipulates the audience into thinking one thing and then revealing that, in fact, it was not what they were thinking in the first place. And, of course, I'd be remiss not to talk about the horror present within the film. Caligari's horror themes are found specifically within Dr. Caligari and Cesar, the manipulator and the mind-controlled murderous monster. Caligari is a seemingly innocent showman, but is a devilish mastermind, and Cesar is a creature of the night, slinking through the city streets and taking lives, even kidnapping someone at one point in the film. With story and themes covered, let's talk about technical aspects. Overall, this is a relatively simple showcase of camera work and editing. It was a product of Germany's economic state at the time, but at the same time, I think it does a lot for this film. There was a noticeable lack of complex camera placements. Most of the shots found within the film were medium shots, though sometimes you would see the occasional close-up. Its reliance on medium shots were to highlight specifically the actors and its sets. Keep in mind this picture on the right. I will talk about the set design very soon, so keep that in mind. Also, this lack of complex complexity within the camera and editing led to a theatrical feel over cinematic feel, which is to say the shots are continuous. There are primarily no breaks within continuity, which gives it a very stage play feel. And furthermore, even though I talked about heavy lighting in chiaroscuro, Caligari specifically did not rely on this. It primarily did, it did not rely on chiaroscuro to achieve its mood and tone. This is primarily done through its actors and set design. Speaking of set design and primarily aesthetics, let's talk about what I consider the defining part of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Aesthetics. A lot of its eeriness and uncanny atmosphere can be largely attributed to its set design. Much of the architecture found within the film is unnatural. Their designs make absolutely no sense within the definition of, air quotes, normal. Sharp angles make up a majority of the buildings within the town, and fixtures on these buildings, be it windows, railings, or chimneys, are equally distorted. These sharp angles on these two examples from the rooftops, this is a rooftop by the way, to the railings here, create such a alien feel, but also, given how everything else is staged, you can't help but to feel like the humans themselves are somewhat alien in regards to this. Moving on to interiors, these interiors are distorted as well. Their dimensions and scale vary amongst one another. Rooms can be open or confining with no clear indicator as to how high the ceiling could possibly be. Shadows and lights are directly painted onto the sets, and like everything else, are warped. These are two interior shots, and you really cannot tell how tall the room is. The leftmost example has a lot of actors within the shot, and the walls are very high. In fact, the arch on the right side the arch over here on the right side still is cut off by the frame, so we don't know exactly how high that arch could go. And yet, despite it looking so big, it still feels populated, but at the same time, these actors don't quite fit in. And then we have this small room, air quotes small room to the right. It's curved. The lighting, the windows are curved. The light coming through the windows are painted on, but also curve as well. We don't know how compact this room is, but with enough distortion through its design, you can see that the room is relatively confining. And yet we still don't see the ceiling. The actors here still feel small despite this room being relatively small in construction. And it's this distortion and unnatural sensation unnatural sensation is so strong that it transcends even into the intertitle cards where text would appear for dialogue and narration. This was a mainstay for all silent films at the time, dating, of course, pre-talkies. The background designs and font reflect the expressionist design of the posters and art pieces as well. Now, with that said, let's talk about the actors and characters. This is a very important aspect that I want to point out. While these are still pictures, they all over-exaggerate their movements and reactions within their scenes regardless of whether something good or bad occurs. The sets that they appear in, which you've seen before, make them either feel too big or too small, never just right. It is the actors do not appear comfortably sized within these sets, and that is a good thing, because that is what the Expressionism movement is about. German Expressionism movement is primarily about. It is expressing harsh emotions and extreme emotions, and in this case, in Caligari's case, just the sense of unease and strangeness. Cesar, this lovely individual here in the top left, is notably a standout character, primarily known for his makeup. Look at that eyeshadow. Look at that makeup. I'm gonna nerd about a bit. I'm gonna break pace and nerd about that makeup. Good gracious, that makeup is gorgeous. It looks very familiar to some things you might have noticed. If you've kept in mind, if you are relatively in tune with anything emo, keep that in mind, because we will briefly touch about that at the end. But drawing us back into Cesar, not only his makeup, but his manic movements and relatively simple outfit help blend the character and the world together. Now, with that said and covered, let's talk about the legacy of Caligari. Caligari's success would influence other German Expressionism films, which later in turn be key films themselves within the movement. Films such as Nosferatu, Metropolis, and M would draw inspiration from Caligari one way or another. From left to right, from the supernatural man-made monster to a mass murderer on a loose. These are inspirations that can all be traced back to our loving hypnotist and his somnambulist. Now, moving beyond Germany, Cesar and Caligari both influence future figures in horror, like in English. Cesar, the mind-controlled murderer, would serve as the primary inspiration for monster flicks. Alright, chat, I'm gonna ask for your help. Picture this scenario. Someone wakes up a sleeping monster. Said monster slowly creeps through the night, killing those unfortunate to cross its path. Does that premise sound familiar? By any chance? Does anything sound remotely similar to what I just described? An unknown creature is woken up by someone, and then they go on a murderous rampage. Does that premise sound familiar? There is a lot that can be described. Let's see if anyone can point out anything specific. It's okay if you don't. But I'm curious if anyone in chat has an idea of what I am implying here. The idea of someone, good or bad, waking up a sleeping monster, and then said monster goes through the town at night, killing those unfortunate to cross their path. Sonic Adventure 2. No, not Sonic Adventure 2. Thank you, Seal. +2, but no. If this premise sounds any... You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I would call that a stretch, but I see the vision. So, with Shadow in mind, if this premise of a monster mindlessly killing those that it comes across because someone was unfortunate enough to wake it up, it's because Cesar was likely the inspiration for individuals such as Frankenstein and the Mummy. If you have Cesar to thank for bringing Frankenstein and Mummy to life, per se. And by extension, I guess Shadow the Hedgehog, too. You should thank Cesar for bringing Shadow to life. With that said, let's go to Caligari, our loving hypnotist, air quotes on the loving part. Does a person with a supernatural ability to manipulate and control others ring a bell by any chance? Again, I'm turning it to chat. Does anything come to mind? I have one, aside from the one that it did not list here. The one that is primarily relevant, but I do have another example. At least 5 Pokemon episodes. No, Mega Malamar does not count. Okay, Mega Malamar might count. Mega Malamar might count now that I think about it. Yeah, Mega Malamar counts, I'm calling it. This is a very serious session of film history, I promise. But aside from Pokemon, any other ideas that come to mind? An individual with a supernatural ability to control and or manipulate others by any chance? Think old school horror. Does anyone come to mind? I talked about this individual. They had a film made. They had a film about them made. If the idea of someone, say, mind controlling others in some way, shape, or form, ring a bell. It is indeed Dracula. Bela Lugosi, our good Count Dracula, is indeed inspired by good old Dr. Caligari. If you think about it, a supernatural individual with a supernatural ability to control others? Sounds like Dracula to me. Of course, these two examples, amongst other examples like Shadow the Hedgehog and Mega Malamar, are just a few of many that Cesar and Caligari have influenced, overt or not. So, moving ever wider, expanding our scope ever wider, let's talk about the German Expressionist movement as a whole. No, indeed. Bela Lugosi did play Dracula, and Dracula was largely inspired by Dr. Caligari, but Bela Lugosi was close enough in my book. Anyways, back on topic. We've already covered Caligari's legacy, so let's widen our lens yet again and focus back on the movement as a whole. Specifically, how Germany and US are related during this time frame. So, in the later years, many German filmmakers fled their country because the Nazis were gaining more power. Interestingly enough, many of them fled to Hollywood in a somewhat humorous coincidence, considering the initial reception to German cinema at the start of at the start of this movement, rather. As such, German Expressionism would seep into Hollywood films, and aspects from this movement would go on to define even genres. Also, a quick fun fact about this time frame. Does that person look familiar to you all? Does this master suspense look familiar to you at all, chat? By any means? I'm gonna take a drink of water, hold on. Yes, Hitchcock, good. Quick tidbit about Hitchcock during this time period. Our loving master suspense worked in Berlin to produce a film. Called The Blackguard, released in 1925. So, if you watch The Blackguard and then watch some of Hitchcock's other films, and of course watch a good chunk of German Expressionism films, you might notice that Hitchcock borrows aspects from this film movement in some of his own films, and he did, because Hitchcock cited it. Hitchcock said so, that German Expressionism was a source of inspiration for some of his movies. Moving to the German specifically, I'd like to point out one specific individual, Karl Freirund, and his contributions to horror, specifically early US horror cinema. He is primarily known for his innovations with camera techniques, but I am not focusing on that. I want to focus on his work within horror films and cinema in general. So, Freund was born in January 16th of 1890, and he was a Bohemian cinematographer that helped produce the immensely famous Metropolis. He was the cinematographer for this film, and he would continue to work with Lang until he immigrated to America in 1929. It was here that he found himself as the cinematographer for Dracula. Would you look at that? It all comes back to Dracula in some way, shape, or form, and I find that very funny. But yes, a German Expressionist cinematographer worked on the film that would define the word horror film. So keep that in mind, because Karl would find himself directing The Mummy in 1932. Now, The Mummy is a production headed by Universal Pictures. So, both Dracula and The Mummy's success would influence Universal's horror going forward. Now, I mentioned that German Expressionism goes beyond influencing horror. That all of its aspects came to form its own genre. It's film noir. Many of German Expressionism's aspects translate very, very nicely to the world and genre of film noirs. There is a lot of commonality between the two themes, themes such as social anxieties, dark outlooks, the focus on the human psyche and the mind are just a few examples. There are many, many more. German Expressionism films were often set in populated spaces where crime was occurring, and there was either a singular or a collective effort to find the culprit and right the wrong. Technically, on the technical aspect, like in English, a major characteristic and technical aspect from German Expressionism that carried over was lighting. Many, if not all film noirs relied heavily on chiaroscuro lighting. Many shots and scenes use extreme shadows and hard contrasts to frame the characters to reflect their state of minds. If I were to recommend a film from German Expressionism that is closely tied or close enough to film noir to be considered a film noir in itself, I would say Fritz Lang's M. I mentioned it briefly earlier. 1932 is the closest film from German Expressionism that I would say is related to film noir. It is a great film, and I suggest you watch it. And yes, extreme shadows and hard contrasts. Sorry, 1931. I know my years. I'm a professional. Please watch Fritz Lang's M. It is a great thriller, crime, almost horror film. I implore you to watch any of these films that I mentioned. I beg you, watch them. They are good. There is a lot of great things left in old/early cinema that are just waiting to be discovered. I implore you, watch it. Watch it. Okay, nerding out aside, I'm gonna nerd out even more. Further widening the scope. Let's go full. What's the reverse of zoom? Let's widen our lens to the widest setting possible. German Expressionism's influence can be felt in modern media basically to this day. These are some examples that I've streamed or played personally or just talked about with somebody else. In short, this is a slide where I get to nerd out for a bit. Very, very hard in a very, very loose manner. So I recently finished Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Yeah, that takes from German Expressionism too. Vampire the Masquerade, yeah, they have an entire clan called the Nosferatu, and I don't think I need to explain how that is related to German Expressionism, do I? Moving beyond that, and of course, Gary. This is Gary. I love Gary because not only is he a Nosferatu, but he's an actor and you find him in Hollywood. The parallels to the original Nosferatu is so strong, and I giggled. I was bouncing in my seat when I found Gary. I love Gary so much. I love Gary so much. I love Gary. Can't you tell I love Gary? Okay, I've nerded about a film of fictional actor. Let's talk about the architecture. The architecture is very reminiscent of Metropolis, a film that I've very briefly covered here, but Metropolis is known for its architecture, primarily. Its tall building, its grandiose designs, its quite frankly outrageous sculptures and the like. And you can see Metropolis's influence primarily in downtown, the downtown area of Los Angeles within Bloodlines. And this is just the entrance to Venture Tower, but you can see it here. Very grand, very tall. The sculptures of the bodies are very exaggerated as well, distorted to an extreme extent, and it's just all so good. I was nerding it. I was smiling when I first set foot in downtown. Aside from that, if we're going to more it's not a phase territory, My Chemical Romance has specifically noted that Metropolis and Caligari have been sources of inspiration for the Black Parade. So when I mentioned Cesar, this is what I was alluding to. You might find some very strong resemblances in the makeup used within their music video, and of course the makeup and costuming found on Cesar as well. So yes, it did find its way into our beloved emo circle. And going back to another thing as well, Rapture. I played BioShock around summer, the first BioShock, around late summer, I believe, late midsummer this year, and that is a direct call out to the massive cityscape of Metropolis, not only in design but in themes as well. Both Metropolis and Rapture find themselves in a class struggle between the haves and have-nots, and of course the issue of solving it is placed on one individual. And in the case of BioShock, they were asked ever so kindly to right all the wrongs plaguing Rapture. And of course, these are just a few examples. There are many, many more examples throughout media. So with that in mind, keep an eye out and see if you can't notice anything that may or may not be a callback to our beloved German Expressionism. And on that note, chat, that's all, folks. That is my entire session of Box Talks. And that's all I wrote for this first session, chat. How'd I do? How did I do?